Once upon a time, in the swing of rivers and oceans, when the waves gently hit the shores, the world experienced such a great change that it would be written about in history books for pages, but perhaps it would never truly be forgotten. Once a quiet island, with peaceful lands and a people who went about their own way, it suddenly shone like a star, and then it came under the influence of such a great power that the marks of that power would be left on every corner of the island. This all began when the Normans stepped onto the soil of England. Before everything, there was a time that was a little unclear, a little lost. But then the year 1066 arrived. That year marked the beginning of one of history's greatest struggles. A year, the merging of one people with another culture, the changing of the landscape, and the laying of the foundation stones for an empire. Now let's look back at this story. Which paths were taken and which battles were fought? Who won these lands and who lost them? In a land once ruled by Vikings, was a new ruler being born? Everything began on that beautiful October morning on the grounds of Hastings. At a point in history, many words were still on people's tongues thousands of years later. Would William, the one known as the Conqueror, achieve victory? Who would hold England or crowns? This was just any battle. A culture, a history, a world was changing, and it all lay behind one day, one battle, and one man. Come, let HERM trace the footsteps of this historical transformation, step by step, and bear witness to time. All great victories sometimes start with losses. Back then, no one could have predicted how much blood would be spilled or how many lives would change. But now, at the turning point of history, we are a loss. Witness the journeys of William and Harold, and how courage, victory, loss, and hope coexisted. Ah, the Normans. This name only echoes in the minds of many when they think of the seas and victories. But their roots, their lands, and their seas trace back to a time long before, to a different world. If at one time they were known as a brave and wild seafaring people, the foundation of that people goes much deeper, all the way back to the years when the Vikings set sail. These people began to open up to the seas from Norway and Denmark in the 9th century. These men, whose lives were shaped by the depths of the ocean, knew little of the land, but they knew the seas well. While dancing with the waves, gliding like a sailboat in the cool waters of the ocean, the Vikings were explorers, raiders. They would invade every piece of land they came upon, conquering every village, every town, every kingdom. No matter how much you talk about it, there's one thing they say: the secret of the sea is always hidden within courage. The Normans' rise to the stage of history is the legacy of these brave Viking descendants. Before I tell you about those times, back in 911, a Viking prince from Denmark, a man named Rollo, set foot on French soil. This man became the lord of a region called Normandy, making a peace treaty with the King of France and gaining land from him. Back then, this was no ordinary victory for the Vikings. In search of both land and peace, they found Normandy, which grew like a forest in hands, and this place became a homeland for the Norman people. The Normans realized how well they knew the rivers and seas, and from that day on, the years would begin in Normandy, where Viking ambition, courage, and strength took shape. But as time passed, it was not just the strict Viking rules that influenced these lands, but also the culture of the French. This was the moment when the Normans, following a different path from the other Vikings, would become part of history as both seafarers and settlers. Over time, the wild journeys of the Vikings gave way to agriculture and a settled lifestyle. The Normans, solidifying their connection to the land, became great landowners. Think about it. The new generation born from this land was about to embark on a journey that would change the course of history. This people, relying on both the power of the sea and the deals they would make on land, would open the doors to a new era. This generation was not just a reflection of the Viking spirit, nor just the legacy of a people from France. They were about to lay the foundations of a new world, a culture united. However, something else would shape this people. Their most important legacy was always the sea, but now they would look beyond those seas. They had gone so far that they would attempt to settle for raiding and conquering by making isolated raids. Their eyes were set on something much greater. With each step there was a change in their lands, in their seas, in their thoughts. Now, under William's leadership, the Normans would seek a new destiny. But where would that destiny lead them? Would it take them far beyond their homeland? Or would they lay the foundations of an empire? The origins of the Normans and their Viking connections left deep marks, not just in the history of their time, but throughout our entire world. They charted their course with courage, intellect, and a kind of search for freedom. While conquering the seas on one hand, they were building a great culture on their lands. But one thing they knew, life was a struggle, and every struggle had an end. So, what would the next step be? How would the first steps of that great battle be taken? And how would a people, by writing their own destiny, step forward on the stage of history? William. Yeah, we are going to dive deep into his story, but before we get into that, we need to understand what was going on in England at the time. A good historian always catches the vibe behind the events. The roots, the reasons, everything shapes up based on a persona, ambition, and goals, The time exactly how William was shaped. So, we need to look back at England. The year 1066 was a dark time for England, but at the same time it was the beginning of a transformation. In charge of the government was a man named Harold Godwinson. He was from a powerful Anglo-Saxon family and had great influence over his lands. But he was right at the heart of a royal dispute, because England's king at the time, Edward the Confessor, suddenly passed away. Edward had maintained a stable government for many years, but now, who would sit on the throne? Harald quickly took the throne after Edward Eoten's death, but there was uncertainty here. There were other claims to the throne. From the Norman lands, there was William, the young yet determined leader, Lord of the Duchy of Normandy. William considered himself the rightful heir to the English throne. Back in 1051, Edward had promised William that he would be the successor to the English throne. After all, there had been a long relationship between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, which strengthened William's belief in his own power. However, Harold at that time hadn't been part of the royal succession plan, or more accurately, he had opposed William's claims. However, Harold didn't guarantee to win the crown so easily. And here Harold had forgotten part. A year before, Harold had gone on a mission to the Duchy of Normandy and sworn loyalty to William. But he didn't understand the consequences of this oath back then. In 1064, Harold had found himself in an accident and had made a pledge of loyalty to William. That day he witnessed the complexity between a leader and a power and their word, and how powerful a threat that could be. Once a man makes an agreement, he should stand by his word, right? But Harold, as another Anglo-Saxon leader, forgot his previous loyalty when he ascended to the throne and relied on the support of his people. And this was a very challenging situation for William. William understood that behind this betrayal lay a great responsibility. He had a very valuable goal, a life purpose he was chasing. For him, ascending to the throne was no attempt to just about gaining land. It held much greater meaning. This was the spirit of the Vikings, the honor of Normandy, the fate of a people. It was an attempt to just England a future. It was a journey that would reshape the map of all of Europe. So, William began preparing to conquer England in a way that would strengthen his claims. With the support of the French government and being someone who knew the English government and people, he planned to take control of the land. But the real question was, how much could Harold resist William's claims? When he took the throne with the support of his people, it was not enough to just about the war. The result of that war and the deep changes that would follow would change the fate of England. In England there were two great powers, two leaders, each insisting on their own righteousness, creating a conflict. But this clash would not just be limited to their struggle. It would have far-reaching consequences. Back then, no one really knew which people, which culture, and which power would come out on top. Now think about it. With so many claims to the throne, what were William and Muir's plans? For him, this victory was a mere attack, just a reward. It was the continuation of his lineage, the future of Normandy, and the direction of history. But for Harold, it was a whole different story. His decision would shape not just the future of his people and family, but the survival of England's throne as well. So where and how would the first shot in this grand battle be fired? We are into a turning point now. William wanted to win his fight for the throne, but it was not just about a throne. This was a war that would shape the future of a people, the dominance of a culture, the destiny of a nation. And every great conquest, every victory begins with preparation. As the leader of the Duchy of Normandy, William had to trust the power of the sea before even stepping onto land. This was a vital key to giving him a piece of land that meant so much more to him than just land. Conquering England symbolized breaking free from slavery, from a yoke of oppression. As William built his fleet, he was sure not to overlook any detail from the start. By the summer of 1066, preparations were quickly coming to an end. On the shores of Normandy, soldiers loyal to William gathered in an unseen calm for the day they would set out to sea. This was a preparation that would change all of Europe. Every sail, every boat, every mast, every soldier carried its own story. And the sea was always there. The waves, crashing together with the first light of morning, stood before this great force. But William had a secret. He didn't see the sea as just an obstacle. Instead, he had made a friendship with it. In the face of the challenges the sea would bring, William, as a leader, knew very well how to fight it, how to command it. Many sailors, when joined with a good captain, Donny, former triplescent, just make peace with the sea, they make peace with fate itself. The Norman fleet was noana eteta, just strong in numbers. Every soldier was a professional, used to fighting at sea. As he built this fleet, William drew inspiration from the Viking warriors of the past. Like them, the soldiers of Normandy were brave and determined. He had admired the victories the Vikings had won against the waves, and had brought that same courageous spirit into his ranks. Each sail, each arrow, each shield, Dinaye Ur Timtalt, just symbolized the power of a soldier, but the resilience and belief of a people. This fleet was becoming a massive armada, carrying all of Norma Eur to military might. While the fleet was being prepared, everything was being organized with extreme care under William Tem command. In various ports of Normandy, ships lined with wooden shingles, decorated with crosses and arranged neatly on land in parallel with the sea, were ready to go. There were so many ships that the sight spread across the sea like a device communicating with another world. Each ship or tem, purpose was no or tem, just to fight. It was also to make history, to quickly capture the changing times. But it was not in AURT and Timor just soldiers and ships that were part of William AURT and preparations. There was another crucial detail, logistics and support. A conquest in AURT and only made with swords, spears, or shields. A real conquest is made with food, drink, weapons, arrows, bows, and most importantly, morale support. William didn't AURT and just want his soldiers to be strong. He also wanted to make sure they were resilient and motivated. This preparation was Nana aimed for, a journey that would last a few days. It was a long process for the future of a nation. For him, every man was part of the fleet. Every man was a link in the chain of history. Then there were the carpenters who built the ships. They shaped each ship with days and months of effort. These ships, which would glide over the waves, would become eternal memories in the pages of history. Every piece of wood was a symbol of great trust. William, not just with his soldiers, but with every ship approaching the limits of the sea, And then the moment came. When the preparations were complete, every ship was ready to set sail. But Williamaya, enter, in her voice never stopped for a second. No matter the outcome, it felt like the war would never end. Which decision, which direction, which wave? Williamaya him alone on this journey. Each one of them was writing a story with him. The struggle of a group of brave men to take England Ayatim's crown land was laying the foundation for the near future. They would move forward together, but on land, an obstacle awaited them. Could Harold stop the Normans? How would Norman Daerm's great journey respond to Harold? Sometimes history holds deeper meanings than just the outbreak of a war, and some wars not only change the fate of a people or a nation, but also reshape the entire world. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was one of those wars. In September of 1066, it became a symbol of the resistance and bravery of a people. This battle was Nada era defeat. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. At that moment, one of the last great leaders of the Vikings, Harold Hardrada, was about to experience one of the bloodiest moments in history on English soil. Harold Hardrada was a fearless warrior and tactical genius who lived through the golden age of the Vikings. As the King of Norway, he dreamed of the revival of the ancient Viking kingdoms. But this dream, it turned out, collided with the struggle of another great leader fighting for the throne in England. On the eve of William Ayrtiem's invasion of England, Hardrada set out for England with his own ambitions, hoping to reach his goal. However, he and his Norwegian warriors would face an unexpected clash at an unexpected time and in an unexpected way. Harold Godwinson, one of England's leading leaders, was the first line of defense against the Norman invasion. The Vikings he faced at Stamford Bridge had planted the seeds of a war that had not yet fully involved him. As the Viking threat approached his lands, Godwinson immediately sprang into action. As always, he had one thing on his mind: protect England. But before landing on the shores, Harold each of them was a fierce Viking warrior, each of them a legend in their own right. But the English army was equally brave and determined. At Stamford Bridge, the Vikings had set up camp on the land near the edge of the forest, and everything was expected to proceed as planned. However, Godwin, Sana, Aer, NTM, army would break through this quiet night with a midnight attack. The unexpected assault shook the entire Viking camp. Godwinson, having completed his preparations the day before, decided to surprise the Vikings with a strike. This surprise attack was a huge shock for the Vikings. Things developed so quickly that Hardrada and his men, without fully understanding what was happening, had to rush to defend the bridge. That moment marked the beginning of one of the greatest battles in history. The cool air was filled with the brutal sounds of war. Swords clashed and arrows flew through the air. The Vikings were trying to honor their tough fight and the leadership of their great leader Hardrada. But Godwin Sana Ayrtiem's men were pressing on every front. Many Viking warriors had left their homeland and their past behind when they came here. In their eyes, there was a respect for the Viking legacy, but in that moment there was also a fight for survival. Each shield, each sword, each arrow was driven by the will to live. And then, in the midst of that dark day, the final clash erupted. Hardrada stood tall in the middle of the battle. His eyes carried the weight of years of victories and heroism. But this battle would be his last. An arrow struck the Viking leader in the heart. His fall marked the end of a legend on English soil. At that moment, it was na Zenoatem to just Hardrada It was the end of the Viking Golden Age and Hardrada Tem reign. History would record not only the death of Hardrada, but also the end of the Viking victory influence on England. This was not just the fate of one leader, but of an entire people. And Hardrada Tem's death signaled the fading of the Viking victories, the last of their resistance, and the loss of a power that would never return. After taking a heavy blow at Stamford Bridge, the surviving Vikings had no choice but to retreat. Hardrada eortem, in death, set in motion another important step that would shape the future of England and Europe. But this was only the beginning. Harold Godwinson had defeated the Vikings, but on the other side, another enemy, another tough rival awaited him, the Normans. William the Conqueror's departure from Normandy marked England Eortem's final trial before its fall. But what would be the cost of winning this battle? What would England face after this victory? Sometimes history carries much deeper meanings than the eruption of a war. And some wars don't just change the fate of a people or a nation, they reshape the entire world. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was one of those wars. In September 1066, it became a symbol of a people's resilience and courage. This battle was an AERLTMT, just about a victory or a defeat. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. In those moments, one of the last great Viking leaders, Harold Hardrada, was about to experience one of the bloodiest moments in history on English soil. Harold Hardrada was a fearless warrior and a tactical genius who lived in the golden age of the Vikings. As the King of Norway, he dreamed of reviving the old Viking kingdoms. But his dream intersected with another great leader, AERTM, fight for the throne of England. Just as William was preparing his invasion of England, Hardrada was also heading toward England, bravely pursuing his own goals. However, he and his Norwegian warriors were about to meet in an unexpected way, at an unexpected time. Harold Godwinson was one of England's AOCM leading leaders and was defending the first lands that would face the Norman invasion. The Vikings he encountered at Stamford Bridge were the first seeds of a war that had not yet fully unfolded. As the Viking threat approached his land, Godwinson immediately took action. As always, he had only one thing on his mind: protect England. But before stepping onto land, Hardrada's army was a powerful opponent. Every one of them was a fierce Viking warrior, legends in their own right. But Englander, MER, was also equally brave and determined. At Stamford Bridge, the Vikings' large army had camped on the lands near the edge of the forest, expecting everything to go as planned. However, Godwinson's Sona ERM, MRAR attempt to rake through that quiet night with a midnight attack. A surprise assault shook the entire Viking camp. Godwinson had finished his battle preparations the day before and decided to surprise the Vikings with his men. This unexpected attack was a huge shock for the Vikings. Everything happened so fast that Hardrada and his men couldn't understand what was going on before they started defending the bridge. That moment marked the beginning of one of the greatest battles in history. The air was cold, filled with the brutal sounds of war. Swords clashed while arrows soared through the sky. The Vikings tried to honor their difficult battles and their great leader Hardrada's leadership, but Godwinson's Sonaeter men were applying pressure from all sides. Many Viking warriors had left behind their lands and pasts when they arrived there. In their eyes, there was respect for the Viking legacy, but at that moment, there was also the fight for survival. Every shield, every sword, every arrow was driven by the will to survive. And right there, in that dark day, the final clash erupted. Hardrada stood tall in the middle of the battle. His eyes were filled with victories and heroic tales from the past. But this battle was to be his end. An arrow struck the Viking leader in the heart. His fall marked the end of a legend on English soil. That moment marked the end of the golden age of the Vikings, and Hardrada MP's death, but also the end of the Viking MP's influence over England. This was not just the fate of one leader, but of an entire people. Hardrada AERM. Death heralded the end of the Vikings' final victories, their last stand, and their inevitable disappearance. After taking a heavy blow at Stamford Bridge, the surviving Vikings had to retreat. Hardrada's death also initiated another significant step that would shape the future of England and Europe. But this was only the beginning. Harold Godwinson had defeated the Vikings on one front, but on another, a new, fierce enemy awaited him: the Normans. William Marit's departure from Normandy marked Marit's final trial before its fall. But what would the cost of winning this battle be? And after this victory, what awaited England? On October 14th, 1066, everything was set for the battle that would determine who would rule the lands of England. What started as just another regular day would soon erupt into a conflict that would leave a deep mark in history, becoming a memory that would be remembered for generations. The weather was cold, but the winds were calm. Near the town of Hastings in Sussex, England, the area where everything would be decided was surrounded by a dark and dramatic atmosphere. Every blade of grass, every piece of land seemed to carry the weight of the moment. William the Conqueror's army quickly prepared for battle as soon as they landed from their ships. There was fire in their eyes, a goal, a desire for victory. They were the heirs of the old Viking lands, and these men from Normandy had gathered here on these grounds to make history. William, along with his commanders, had thought of every detail and had prepared the army in the best possible way. This was an reshaped, just a fight for land. It was a moment that would shape the future. The throne of England was in his and his men reshaped hands. But no matter how strong they were, Harold Godwinson, the EOSTM's army was just as determined. Harold had gained great morale from his victory at Stamford Bridge, but that win had come at a heavy cost. It had drained his entire army, and many of his soldiers were badly hurt. However, Harold had come together for one final stand against the Normans. In his eyes, this battle meant more than just land. It was for his people. This land, these people, were the heritage of his bloodline and history. They knew the enemy AERTM position well, but time was running out, and their forces were exhausted. As the battle's start time drew near in Hastings, both sides had gathered in large numbers, ready to fight. William the Conqueror's army had risked everything to enter England, filled with the desire to dominate the English. The Normans had a wide variety of troops, from archers to cavalry to heavy infantry. William skillfully led them and completed their preparations. But Harold the Conqueror's army was no ARMT. Just any army either. The English had won many victories, experienced in both naval and land warfare. But by that morning, the loss of their best units and leaders would be a huge disadvantage. Then, as the battle was about to begin, William the men flag slowly but steadily began to wave. The Normans were ready for war. Gathered in disciplined formations, there was no fear, no hesitation. Every soldier was filled with faith in William his victory. But Harold and his army, as defenders of their land, were going to do everything they could to stand against William. This battle, which would go down in history, was not just a struggle for land, it was a struggle for identity. Who would rule England? Which form of governance would be best for these lands? All these questions were the hidden reasons behind this war. When the battle began, the first arrows soared through the air, and a deep cry echoed. But that cry was just the beginning. As the two armies clashed, noise and chaos engulfed the battlefield. The Normans, with their powerful archers and cavalry, were trying to break through the English defenses. The English, using traditional battle formations and tactics on their own land, fought to hold their ground. The land seemed to turn into a sea of blood. The Winda Yoetm's speed seemed to be watching over the battle. La Sauce Corse, which army would come out on top? One side, La Sauce victory, would be the other side, disaster. William made his most important move, beginning to push on the English defensive lines. His commands echoed like a ghost in the minds of the soldiers around him. Each move was setting up the next. This battle was not just a challenge, but the result of strategy. Harold had shown his last resistance, but in the end, the Normans would win, and that morning, history would be changed forever. When Harold was wounded by an arrow in the middle of the battle, his fate was sealed. His failure was the result of the losses his army had suffered up until that point. But Harold the Conqueror's fall was not ERTMTS, just the end of one man. It was the end of an era. At that moment, perhaps not just Harold, but England itself had lost. William stood with his arms crossed over his chest. having gained a new victory. But this victory symbolized the end of not just a piece of land, but also an era. The Battle of Hastings was not just a battle, it was a moment that changed the course of history. William had won, but would the cost of victory be too high? Would those lands, that people, really belong to him no matter how close they seemed? Hastings wasn't just a battlefield. It was the beginning of a story buried deep in time. But when looking back after such devastation, would peace truly come? The noise that had torn through the lands of the Battle of Hastings gradually slowed, like the flow of time itself, fading into a deep silence. But this silence was nothing more than a brief moment of rest. Each person, every soldier amidst the fallen and the wounded, pondered the meaning of their lives and their future. Yet, there was something that drew every gaze to one place: Harold. Harold Godwinson had begun that day wearing the crown of a king, fighting desperately to defend his lands. But even as the battle started, did he know that its end would draw near, that the storm in history would bring a fate that would erase his name forever? That morning, in the heat of the battle, as an arrow struck his body, his death was Wanori, just the end of his own life, but the preparation of England for a destiny. However, when the final moments came, it wasn't an end, but rather a beginning. For Harold death signaled not just the fall of one man, but the dawn of a new era that would shape the future of his people and his land for millennia to come. In his final struggle, Harold reached out as though trying to hold on to the lost hours of time. Amidst the bodies and blood scattered across the battlefield, perhaps he opened his eyes and dreamed of victory one last time. But in that moment, he realized the cruel truth of the world. A scream echoed, but it was not the cry of one person alone. That scream was the echo of all of England, of its people, its land, and its very soul. At that moment, when the battle had ended, there was a death, but there was also something else, an emptiness. Englanda Eorum's throne was vacant. Once Haralda Eorum, it was now held by hands foreign to the land. Once William had decisively claimed victory, he began to dismantle the final resistance of the English army. Commanders and warriors alike had lost their lives. This was not just an end, but the beginning of a process of disintegration. The English had lost all their power, and the last remnants of confidence in their army vanished with the death of Harold. The heart of their forces had lost its courage and strength, for with Harold's death it was the Neortum T, just a king that had been lost, but the hope of the land itself. The soldiers, each trying to survive in their own way, scattered. Some fled the battlefield, while others accepted their fate, abandoning the land they had once vowed to protect. The Armea, or ETM, simply a military collapse. AERs. It was the dissolution of a people. Every town, every village, every peasant in England stood at the brink of destruction. This disintegration created a profound uncertainty about the future of the people. William EARETM. Victory became not a triumph of the victors, but a symbol of the fear, destruction, and abandonment felt by the losers. The people who had followed Harold, bearing every battle and every loss, saw his death as the shattering of their spirit. When Harold died, the land was enveloped not in the euphoria of victory, but in an emptiness. Each English soldier seemed to carry the memory of their fallen leader. Some retreated into the battlefield, AERTM's silence, while others succumbed to the tears of victory, AERTM's bitter cost. The hopes of a people in that moment turned into a deep, pervasive fear that gripped their hearts. Those who had once placed everything in Harold now found themselves falling into a void. The turning point that Harilda Eortum's ascension to the throne had marked now gave way to sorrow, a fractured army, and the collapse of a people. Eortum hope. As the battle came to an end, the Normans pressed forward swiftly. But Harald's death was non-ill. Loss became loss. It was the end of an era, the destruction of a people. With his fall, did the spirit of the land also fall, or would it rise and resist again? These questions soon found their answers, but in that moment, Harald's loss became one of the deepest scars written into history. So, what would come next? When would the rise of a people begin? Or was this the final end of all things? William, after securing his victory on the battlefield, began to march toward London with quiet yet determined steps, as though he were living a moment he had awaited his entire life. The dead and wounded left behind were mere silhouettes for history to record. But William, with his soldiers slowly regrouping, was in pursuit of a far greater victory. He aimed not only to conquer the land, but to become the master of an entire kingdom, its people, its soil, and its very essence. This would not be just a conquest, it would be a transformation. William had no intention of leaving any obstacle between himself and making England a part of his kingdom. To become a true ruler was not only about military victory, but about winning the hearts and souls of the people. London had always been the heart of England. Here, the common folk, traders, craftsmen, nobles, and the royal court all came together. William knew how crucial it was to hold London, for it was not merely a physical capital, but the very symbol of the kingdom's power. However, William M.E. marched toward it was not going to be easy. The city, like so many before it, housed not only soldiers but also peasants and civilians who would fight to the bitter end. Even after Harold H.M.'s death, there remained a group of Englishmen who had not yet lost hope and chose to resist in their homeland. These people rejected submission to a foreign ruler, a Norman king. The city HMM's walls, built with stones that carried the memories of past victories, now stood as a reminder of the old order. Yet William was focused on something far beyond those ancient walls and memories. As the Norman army slowly approached, the people of London had already settled along the banks of the river and outside the city walls. Marching toward a city marked by the scars of war was an omen of destruction, of an end. In every village and every town, the people had heard the news of William NTM's approach. There was no place left to run. William came not with the bitter taste of vengeance, but with a firm resolve, his steps echoing the inevitability of what was to come. As anxiety began to spread among the people, those within the city, defenses tried desperately to organize one final stand. Yet, against the might of the Normans, their efforts seemed no more than a desperate chase after hope. William, as he organized his soldiers, faced and overcame each obstacle in his path, pushing forward toward London. When he neared the city walls, an even greater threat loomed. In every neighborhood, on every street, he might encounter those who, with one last effort, tried to defend their homes. But this resistance would not shake William Demon's resolve, discipline, or strength. It would only serve to reinforce them. At the same time, efforts from some of the city's leaders to negotiate with William began to intensify. These were men who had once been loyal to Harold, yet now found themselves crushed under the weight of a new ruler and its pressure. William taking of London was a move that would further dismantle the resistance. Amidst the chaos of the city, those who gathered to talk knew deep down that the victory was inevitable. William's true strength lay not only on the battlefield, but in these diplomatic maneuvers as well. As days passed, the resistance within the walls of London weakened. The city, helpless against the advance of the Normans, fell deeper into despair. Though there were small skirmishes and brief guerrilla fights, William and the army crushed each resistance effort one by one. Once the symbol of England's strength and freedom, this city now lay under the feet of a foreign ruler. Each resistance, each effort, was a sign of William growing dominance and the inevitability of England's fate. Finally, the gates of London opened. The city, AEARTM's walls, which had once been the last defense, now stood silent. William had conquered England, AERTM's capital, and with it had subdued its people once more. But this was no mere physical victory. When William set foot in London AERTM's streets, he had, in truth, brought the entire nation under his rule. Nothing would ever be the same again. These lands, these cities, these people, would now have to come to terms with a new era, a new ruler. And in that moment, the streets of London echoed with the cries of celebration, but a question still lingered in the air. How much would the cost of this victory change the soul of the people, and how would it shape the future of England? After the destruction, how much resistance would remain, or would everything simply bow and submit to the new order? As William walked through the streets of London with determined steps, the fabric of time seemed to shift around him. The city was heading towards perhaps its greatest transformation in history. He was not a mermaid, just a king or a conqueror, but someone preparing to present himself as the master of the people. William's steps did ATRTMT eldest echo on the stones. They resonated in the hearts of the people. In his mind, the thought, "A hero, England is mine," rang constantly. But the victory he had achieved was not the final goal. There was still one greater ambition ahead: the coronation. The coronation ceremonies of England had always been more than a ritual or allure. They were a powerful symbol, shaping not only the rulera allure, the M's power, but also the very future of the people. Over the centuries, these moments, deeply rooted in the traditions of the land, had represented the king Elir. Just a formality. It was a symbol he needed to accept his sovereignty over England. The crown was inertium te merely an ornamentium. It was everything that needed to be claimed. It was the crowning of England, RTM's heart. The act of freeing the people from the grasp of the past and planting the seeds of a new era. Inside one of London's grand palaces, the people had gathered quietly, waiting eagerly for the ceremony to begin. Every corner of the city, every street, seemed to shadow London's every move. The Normans surrounding him, symbols of the land they had conquered, stood in deep respect, understanding the magnitude of the moment. But this ceremony wasn't just meaningful for the Normans, it was significant for the Anglo-Saxon nobles too, those who had once been loyal to Harold, and who now, under the weight of the new rulera aurem power, had little choice but to watch the ceremony unfold. Among them were mixed emotions. Some had accepted their fate, while others struggled to come to terms with it. But they all knew one thing: William had crossed the point of no return. He was the King of England now. The cathedral was bathed in light, streaming through colorful stained glass windows. Eyes were fixed on William, trying to read the expression on his face. He was the living symbol of victory. Aulda, not just in the battlefield, but in every decision, every step, every movement that shaped the land. The coronation was just a moment for the people to accept their new ruler. It was also a reflection of their connection to their past, their future, and their heritage. William entered the cathedral with no hesitation in his steps. It was not just his speed or determination that stood out, but the weight of a kingdom, a nation, a future on his shoulders. His robe glittered with golden embroidery. Each fold, each stitch not only marked a king, but also a conqueror. The images poets, historians, and the people had created in their minds of him were now materialized into flesh and bone. William's and presence marked the beginning of a story that would echo in the walls of London and leave deep scars on the land of England. He slowly ascended to the coronation throne, lifting his feet from the ground. Beneath the cathedral, meant a towering dome. Everything fell into a profound silence. A group of priests and bishops surrounded him. Everyone men's gaze was fixed on the holy crown that would soon rest upon his head. The crown was one meant just an object made of metal. It symbolized the entire sovereignty of these lands, the power and the future of the kingdom. The crown carried not just William MTM's claim, but the people, Alia MTM's dreams, their pain and their hopes. The knot had been tied. Alia, the people were now formally submitting to their new king. However, this moment was now a celebration. A deep silence loomed behind it. The cost of Biliama Mayor. Victory had been high. Many lives had been lost, the land soaked in blood. But this moment also signified an end that would lead into a new beginning, a beginning that would shape England's heart for centuries to come. At the moment the crown was placed upon William Lermt's head, he was closing the door on a dark era and stepping into the light of a new one. But this moment also birthed a question. How long would the reign of this new age last? Would the crowning of the Normans signify the end of William Lermt's conquest? Or would the English people resist, fighting to rediscover their own identity? William, as he stepped forward in the streets of London, felt the very fabric of time shift. The city, on the cusp of its greatest transformation, was on the brink of a new era. He was not England as a king or a conqueror. Now he was. He was about to present himself as the ruler of a people, a master of a land. Each step he took was not just on the cobblestones of London, but on the hearts of its people. In his mind echoed the thought, "O England is mine, year." But victory was not yet complete. There was still one final step to be taken: the coronation. The coronations of England had always been more than a mere ritual. They had symbolized the shaping of a nation, a reshaped destiny. Over the centuries, these sacred moments were not just about a monarchy, reshaped strength, but about the bond forged with the people, the way a reshaped legitimacy was carved out from the very land and its inhabitants. For William, this coronation was not simply a ceremony, it was the moment he would make his reign permanent. The crown was not just a piece of jewelry, it was the embodiment of everything he sought to rule. It meant the heart of England would now beat to his will, that the people, having shed their past, would begin anew under his reign. Inside one of Louis d'Orléans' grand palaces, the people had quietly taken their places, eagerly awaiting the start of the ceremony. Every corner of the city, every street, seemed to watch William as he moved through it. The Normans who surrounded him, his trusted allies, understood the weight of the moment. But this event held significance for more than just the mayor. It was also deeply important for the English. Among the crowd were the Anglo-Saxon nobles, symbols of the past. They observed in silence, their emotions mixed. Some had accepted their fate, while others struggled to come to terms with the reality before them. But they all knew the truth. A Mayor William had passed the point of no return. He was now England. A Mayor Lewayle. King. The cathedral was bathed in the soft glow of stained glass windows, the light filtering through in colors. The eyes of all present were fixed on William, searching his expression for any sign of weakness. He was not just a symbol of victory. He carried the power to shape the future with every step, every decision. The coronation was wana iratem, just the acceptance of his rule. Airatem, it was a symbol of a people, airatem, loyalty to the past, to the future, and to their own identity. William entered the cathedral with unwavering resolve. His movements were deliberate and strong, not just the actions of a man who had conquered a kingdom, but of one who carried the weight of an entire people. Aeoretiam, future. His robes, adorned with gold embroidery, shimmered under the cathedral. Aeoretiam, light. Every stitch not just a sign of a king, but a conqueror etiam triumph. The images that poets, historians, and the people had once imagined about him were now a living reality. His presence marked the beginning of a story that would echo through the walls of London, through the soil of England itself. Slowly, he ascended the coronation throne. Beneath the massive dome of the cathedral, everything seemed to fall into a deep silence. A group of priests and bishops stood around him, their presence adding a sacred air to the proceedings. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the crown that would be placed on William's head. The crown was no mere artifact. It symbolized all the power, all the future of this land. It was a reflection of the people, Aeoretum's dreams, their pain, their aspirations, embodied in a single object. The moment of coronation had come. The ties that bound England Eoratum's people to their past were being severed. William was no longer a conqueror, Eora, he was now the king. But this moment was far from a simple celebration. Behind the grand ceremony there was a heavy silence. The cost of William Setm victory had been immense. Lives had been lost, lands soaked in blood. Yet, this moment was also the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. It marked the beginning of a new era, one that would define the heart of England for centuries. As William donned the crown, he closed the door on a dark chapter in history, and in doing so, opened the door to a new age. But this moment also gave rise to a question that lingered in the air. How long would this new age last? Would the Normanza Ural be cemented by the crown, or would the English people with their deep-rooted identity resist and reclaim their own legacy? From the day William was crowned, the people across England showed immense resistance against the new Norman rule. In these lands, the Anglo-Saxons had their own history, traditions, and freedoms. The Normans were not only attempting to control England, but they were also trying to change the identity of its people. However, the anger they stirred within the population only fueled the flames of resistance. This resistance took many forms across England, from large uprisings to local rebellions, and sometimes even the defiance of a single village could put the Normans in a difficult position. In the beginning, William Aeor.me, new order seemed firmly established. However, the Normans began to feel the resistance of the people from villages to towns. This was not just a military matter, it was also a psychological war. The Normans sought to crush the people Aeor.me sense of independence. With every new move, they were taking land from the old landowners, replacing them with their loyal followers. This was not just about slavery or the transfer of wealth. It was about the loss of identity, honor, and history. The people felt that the freedoms they once had were dissolving under the Norman government, a TERFMT rule. Every new Norman noble created more hatred in the hearts of the Anglo-Saxon people. One of the first major eruptions of resistance began in 1069. This year became a great year of revolt for the Anglo-Saxons. This was not just a rebellion, but a movement where all of England rose up against the Normans. In the north, especially around York, the people launched a massive uprising. This revolt was a reflection of the people's resistance to the new Norman order. York was a major cultural and political center in Anglo-Saxon England. Here, the leaders who stirred the people were from the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and were opposed to William. This resistance was known in El Etra, just an attempt to defend local lands, but it was the first sign of a national uprising against the Normans. This rebellion severely shook William Mayor Sem's power. However, the Norman government mobilized all its forces, not only with military might, but also with cruelty, to suppress this resistance. William, having learned from his previous victories, decided to use fear and oppression to subdue the people. While suppressing the revolt in the north, the Normans besieged York and whipped, burned, and killed the people. But this would not only suppress the rebellion, it would also create immense animosity in the eyes of the people. The Normanza Madeti, barbaric methods, would make them known as rulers who sought not only their land but their hearts as well. After the bloody clash in York, William Mayor rule more firmly established itself in northern England. But this was not the end of the uprisings. Resistance kept sparking in different ways. As the people lost their lands, they continued to join these uprisings, which slowly turned into a fight for freedom. Sometimes the resistance would erupt on a local scale as small uprisings, and at other times large leaders who formed strong armies would lead major rebellions against the Normans. However, each time, the Normans responded with harsher, more brutal measures, instilling fear in the population to subdue them. Especially in the 1070s, these uprisings became more complex. The people were no longer simply trying to regain their land. They were now generating a national reaction against the Norman rule. Every resistance seemed like a new ray of hope, but the Norman government succeeded in crushing each one. Slowly, the pressure the Normans exerted across England began to break the people. A emptious spirit, turning the kingdom into something resembling the slavery of an empire. Despite all these uprisings, William continued to strengthen his rule, not only with military victories, but also by gradually establishing a settled order. However, breaking the people, spirit and completely controlling these lands was no easy task. Every corner had resistance, every town had a quest for freedom, every piece of land had a defiance. This was a real war the Normans had to face, a war that had to be fought not only with weapons but also with culture, belief, and psychological warfare. Resistance was not just a physical opposition but also a symbol of the preservation of the people, spirit, history, and culture in these lands. No matter how much they tried to suppress it, each act of defiance reminded the Anglo-Saxon people of their pride and honor from the past. But there was one question. How much could William preserve his power and land in the end? And perhaps, what would be the final great battle the Normans would face to hold together their rule? William's victory didn't just result in a mere monarchia iura. It fundamentally altered the economic, social, and political structures of England. When the Normans arrived, they were driven not only by military might but also by a profound desire to establish a new order. They decided to create a world where every stone, every village, every possession was counted and recorded. This was Lanayor TMT, just about establishing a strong government. It was a tool that would solidify Norman control and subjugate the people even further. This tool would soon become one of the most important documents in England's history, the Domesday Book. Initiated by William in 1085, the purpose of this grand book was to record everything in England, every village, every house, every field, every pair of oxen, and every sheep. By gathering this data, William sought to control the resources of England and determine the worth of every individual, every piece of land, and every village. However, this was wanure entet joué, just a material census. It was a survey to understand how wealthy or poor the people were, who owned what land, and how much tax each person could pay. With all this information, William would not only monitor the people but also clarify which lands and properties truly belonged to whom. Slowly, the data gathered in the Domesday Book became a weapon that reinforced Norman rule. Every piece of data, every calculation, every land record gave William total control over the land and its resources. This marked a transition from a world where the people lived without knowing the specifics of their lands or possessions to one where everything was recorded and accounted for. The work of recording was done with great precision. William appointed officials to travel to every village, every region, and record every piece of property and every asset with remarkable accuracy. These officials noted the extent of land in each village, the types of work done, and what kinds of farming were practiced. In every village, the structures of buildings, the size of properties, and the numbers of trees and animals were all documented. At the time, it was as if every village and every town in England had been written down in minute detail. However, the significance of the Domesday Book went beyond simply documenting land and property. It represented the form of governance the Normans imposed on England. Through it, the Normans were not only controlling the physical land but also the people. The book recorded who owned what land, thus clarifying ownership rights in case of rebellion or resistance. If anyone wanted to lose or gain land, these records would be the final word. To make the social structure of England visible and to ensure order, the Normans relied heavily on these records. The Normans controlled England by classifying everything and everyone, knowing exactly where everything was. But for the people, this meant significant change. In the old Anglo-Saxon society, land and property were often passed down through bloodlines and cultural ties, managed by communities. The Normans, however, shattered these traditional bonds, opting for a system where everything and everyone was tracked and controlled based on concrete records. The effects of the Domesday Book were felt deeply among the people. The book made it clear that every action, every movement was being recorded. This awareness changed the way people behaved. forcing them to set aside their sense of freedom. In the past, landowners would gather to protect their lands and remain loyal to the leaders who defended them. But now the Normans as a government wanted everything to be documented, ensuring that every individual, a Ur, a peasant, a merchant, a noble, a Ur, knew their place. Yet, the true power of the Domesday Book was not only in solidifying William the Conqueror's rule, but also in institutionalizing the Norman system. Even after William the Conqueror's death, these records would continue to determine the rights of landowners and maintain the Normans' control over the land. The influence of this system was not just about ensuring the strength of the government. It left a lasting legacy for future generations. The Domesday Book was not just a tax record or inventory of property. It was the rewriting of England's social and economic structure. One era, in many ways, the reshaping of the people's identity. Every village, every plot of land, and every persona Aaron's name was etched into the pages of history. But perhaps the most pressing question is this: how much would this book limit the freedom of the people, or would it shape the future of England in a different way? William the Conqueror only changed the fate of England, but it also significantly impacted the destiny of Europe. The 1066 Battle of Hastings victory stirred the Norman desire for expansion, influencing not only England, but other territories across the European continent. The Great Conquest, initiated by William, sent waves through all of Europe, but there is often an overlooked truth. This conquest was not just a military victory, it was a cultural, political, and socio-economic wave of transformation. The Normans had established strong kingdoms across Europe in various periods of history, leaving deep cultural footprints. However, William, with his conquest of England, took this to another level. As the de facto leader of the Duchy of Normandy, William became more than just a monarch. He transformed into a figure who would change the power dynamics across Europe. These changes were just political, they would also alter cultural and military landscapes across the continent. William the Conqueror's victory also led to significant changes in France. While Normandy had been part of the Kingdom of France for a long time, William the Conqueror's conquest of England altered the relationship between the Duchy of Normandy and France. As Duke of Normandy, William took an independent stance from French control and, with his sovereignty over England, became a strong rival to the French monarchy. For the French, this was both a threat and an opportunity. The tension between Normandy and France laid the groundwork for the Anglo-French conflicts that would persist for centuries. Another major impact was the solidification of the feudal system across Europe. While William established feudalism in England, he spread this system through other leaders from Normandy into other parts of Europe. Feudalism, which organized land and power into distinct classes, created a clear social hierarchy, not only in England but also in France and Spain, reinforcing the aristocratic power across the continent. Land and titles were increasingly distributed among warrior nobles, feudal lords, and the papacy, while individuals across society were given distinct social positions. However, one of the most notable effects of the Norman Conquest was the cultural transformation of Europe. William the Conquest led to the blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon cultures. This was not only just a merger of language and traditions. The New England became culturally rich, and the Normans not only established their government, but also influenced areas like art and literature. The French became the language of administration, a development that would shape the evolution of the English language in the years to come. The Normans also had a significant impact on the political structures of Europe. William and other Norman rulers didn't just conquer England. They also carried out campaigns in places like southern Italy and Sicily. The Norman domination of Sicily enhanced the region cultural diversity by strengthening interactions between Arabs, Byzantines, and Latins. This reshaped the political and cultural fabric of Italy. In Sicily, the Normans influenced both the local population and the Byzantines, impacting the religious and cultural structures of the area. This cultural and religious diversity that began in Sicily promoted similar interactions across other parts of Europe. Another outcome of William NTM's victory was the development of military tactics across Europe. The Normans, with their use of archers and cavalry in combination, significantly influenced the military strategies of other European states. William, in particular, used these tactics to great effect on the battlefield, and they impacted the army structures in France and Spain. Yet perhaps the most striking consequence was the deepening of the conflict between England and France. The Norman victory in England caught the attention of France, and the French made efforts in the following years to reclaim their lands in Normandy. This rivalry would continue for centuries, eventually culminating in the 100 Years' OHA War, shaping the trajectory of European power struggles. William Maiorum, conquest and the Norman influence on Europe were not merely the result of a few years of activity. It was the beginning of a great transformation, leading to both military and cultural shifts across Europe. Even today, historians widely study the Normans' broad impact on Europe, and the legacies of these great figures continue to be felt in the historical development of the continent. The biggest question that remains, perhaps, is whether the Normans unintentionally started this vast influence or whether it was all part of a conscious strategy.